Hi there, let's talk about ecological succession. By definition, ecological succession is natural, gradual changes in the types of species that live in an area. And there are two types. One is primary succession, which means it starts from scratch. And the second type is secondary succession. The gradual replacement of one plant community by another through natural processes. Primary succession begins in a place without any soil, mostly barren rock, so sides of volcanoes and mountains, and it'll start with the arrival of living things by something called lichen. Lichen don't need soil to survive, and these original organisms we call pioneer species. The lichen will break down rock and turn it into soil. So let's look at this. In picture A here, you can see barren rock. This was never an ecosystem. It was wasteland, no living things, just rock and other non-living. So what happens is, as you can see on top of the rock, lichen come in to produce acids that will break down the rock. And eventually, the dead lichen will help contribute to small amounts of soil formation. Part B then is the soil, which is thin, will allow small plants like ferns to slowly grow in the area. As soon as over a few decades the soil thickens up, then we get bigger plants that move in and they take root, and this attracts insects and bees and butterflies, small herbivores. Eventually, once the soil is thick and rich, they'll provide shelter for larger animals like birds and mammals, and eventually we will reach what's called the climax community. Climax. Now, this whole process where nature takes root to create a healthy ecosystem takes time. And so this whole process can take sometimes over 100 years. Here's some more examples of lichen on rock. Pioneer species, they crack open the rock and they break it into soil. So primary succession, soil starts to form as lichen and forces of weathering and erosion. When lichen die, they decompose, adding some organic matter to the soil. Then eventually you get plants like moss and ferns to loosen the soil some more. Once the simple plants die, they get more organic material into the soil thickens, and you start to get wildflowers, smaller trees. Plants die, they add more nutrients, and now you're getting larger trees and shrubs. Eventually, birds and mammals will come into the area, and now it's a biodiversity, variety of life. Secondary succession begins in a place that already had soil. Usually what happens is an area gets wiped out by a flood or a forest fire or a volcanic eruption, and it kills off what used to be there. So the area becomes uninhabited by most living things. This could be someone building a mall. So here's a good picture of how succession builds up over time, eventually reaching the climax community. These trees are the climax community, and they're the groups of organisms that take up most of the space in an ecosystem. Here it is again. Succession, as I said before, usually takes lots of years, 150. So what's the climax community? A stable group of plants that's the end result of succession. Does not always mean big trees. In some cases in a desert, cacti are the climax community that take up most of the space, and sometimes grasses in a bulb prairie. But in most forests, it's big trees. If it's a coniferous forest, it's probably a pine tree or a spruce tree. If it's a deciduous forest, the climax community is probably the maple tree. Here it is again. So we get lichen, pioneer species, and over 150 years, eventually we reach the climax community. Here's some examples of secondary succession. So a forest fire burnt this whole forest, but someone came and took a picture about 10 years later, and now our pioneer species has changed. Our pioneer species are now small grass and weeds. Why is our pioneer species not lichen? Well, there's already soil below here, and the soil is rich and thick. So it doesn't take long for secondary succession to work, and our pioneer species in secondary succession is usually small plants, grass and weeds start to show up again and inhabit the ecosystem once more. You can see our pioneer species working away at this barren parking lot. We would call that secondary succession. Eventually, I'll crack open the cement in the parking lot, and pretty soon, if humans aren't around, we will get other large organisms coming in. So that's succession.